Hello lovelies, in a bit of a departure from the norm, we're taking a look at an art book today, though it's sort of role-playing game adjacent, you might say, because it is a Simon Stålenhag book, The Labyrinth, and of course you may know Stålenhag's work through Free League, Year Zero Engine, Tales from the Loop, Things from the Flood, and The Electric State. Now this is a narrative book more akin to The Electric State. It's not clear whether this fits into the timeline of the previous books. There are visual elements that carry across, but then Stålenhag is Stålenhag, and so he has a particular art style and a way of going about things, so you would expect there to be a certain amount of repetition. It is a square hardback book. All of these elements on the cover that you can see, I think, inform you on the choices in the rest of the book, right? It's a very matte finish cover. It has this contrast of this lovely 1970s style grandmother wallpaper with apocalyptic end of the world visions, but then has a very feminine font and all the rest of it. And I think all of these choices are made for very, very particular reasons. And I think a lot of the choices in the interior of the book made for very particular reasons. I just happen to disapprove of those reasons, and I think they detract from the book as a whole. But at the same time, you know, as an art school dropout, I can appreciate from an art criticism and an art historical point of view why those choices were made. I just think they're bad ones. So the short version is, well, spoiler-free-ish, is that the world has ended. These weird black orbs appeared and began doing horrible stuff to the earth, and there was nothing we could do about it, really. That reminds me of an album cover, Fight the Future. Can't remember the band, but that's the single I remember. Anyway, very similar. So yeah, these things appeared and they began transforming the atmosphere, transforming the landscape, warping everything around them. A whole lot of bad news and no fun. And a bunch of humans have retreated into a massive underground bunker / city where they now live, and as far as we know, they're the only survivors of humanity. And we follow the narrative of a female scientist and her brother at one point, and a kid who's one of the last people rescued from the surface before everything went irretrievably to shit. And we know that she is being executed due to some incident that happened on the surface. And the book is framed as like her confession or her internal reflections and recollections of what went on. Now, I feel I must point out that what you're seeing on camera is not what's reflected here on the page. If I look at the camera, I can see far more detail, and the camera has compensated for the desaturation, the matte nature of the paper, the lack of contrast, the lack of vibrance. The camera has somehow compensated for that to the point where I can see far more detail and appreciate the art far better through the webcam than I can on the page. Now I'm assuming that this is something to do with the same reason why you can see through fog with a dash cam but not your eyes, but it does weirdly mean that owning the somewhat expensive physical product here is a worse experience than viewing the art on a computer screen, even in a tiny little reduced preview window. And that's disappointing. Now I can appreciate why the choice was made to desaturate, to use the matte paper to make everything slightly fuzzy and so on, but it does mean that the art is not presented at its best, but rather presented to fit the narrative that is being told, where these two scientists and the kid go up to the surface and spend some time at a monitoring station that they have there, and things go awry. That's about as much as I can say without spoilers, really. Though obviously there's a small amount of text on each page where you do get some text. Now, we don't get a great deal of information about the world or exactly what's going on, and as someone coming at this book from the role-playing games, that is frustrating, because I enjoy world building. I enjoy learning things about that world, and too much in this just relies on implication and your own ideas, which you are projecting onto the text. Again, reinforced by the sheer fuzziness of the images, like the 80s, 90s type tech. Did this disaster happen in the 80s and 90s, or is that just the older reliable technology that remains? And then again, you see some high-tech stuff that you'll have seen in Tales from the Loop, Things from the Flood, and so on. But it's never kind of explicitly pointed out in any particular way. We also don't really learn much about the ongoing unknowable alien terraforming that is going on. We see that the world is dead and there isn't much left, but we also see them taking samples and observing big strange alien growths, but we don't really learn anything about those or why the terraforming is being done, or what or who is behind it. Again, you understand why, obscuring the narrative. These are things that people in the world would already know and wouldn't need to explain. You obscure the art, you obscure the motives, you obscure the story about what's going on. It's all understandable, again, from that critical perspective, as is the repetition of certain elements. But it is still ultimately very, very frustrating. Because you want to see and understand more of the world building is what you're interested in here, and it's just simply not there, unfortunately. Now, we do delve a little bit back into the past, when everything was being done, when the underground city was being set up, and the dangerous and nasty, inhumane things that people got up to in order to defend and protect and complete that project, which is about the survival of humanity. Here we see some of the familiar Stålenhag elements, like the flying ships and so on, which are somewhat incongruous, but also not. We also see some of the security forces and police that were enforcing a boundary around the human survival project. We see some more on the Black Globes and what they did and have done to the world above, and we also see how harsh people had to be in order to protect this one hope for humanity, most starkly illustrated in this big pile of body bags here. And we see the security forces and the use of defensive robots and so on to stop anyone from getting across. But we spend precious little time on that, which is a weird kind of shame, because that is probably the most interesting and visually arresting part of the book. I would have preferred to spend more time on that. Now, at this point, we can't really get too far into showing you anything because there'd be spoilers. But at the end, we do end on an ambiguous note. Can this child, for example, live outside now? Everything else has been killed, but this is left deliberately vague and unknown and unknowable. It leaves you questioning, is that someone's thought? Is it meant to be metaphorical? What is it supposed to be? Or have some people been changed by this same terraforming force so that they can exist out there? It's never made entirely clear. Right, giving scores is probably somewhat futile, but we're going to do it anyway. In terms of style, the book's presentation and everything, it's all cohesive. It all makes sense. I can appreciate the reasons, I think, why they made the choices they did, but it does end up making the art look a lot worse than it should. So normally I would have no hesitation in giving something, you know, thoroughly illustrated by Stålenhag. I would normally give that like a 5 most of the time. But the presentation here just drags the whole thing down. And the choices that were made, while I can understand them, detracts from my enjoyment of the art. And when you buy an art book, you want to appreciate the art. And again, the screen does not give you a realistic view of what is actually presented in the book. On the screen, you can see a great deal more detail, and there appears to be more color depth, more you know the word, more vibrance, and so on than I am seeing physically in person. And call me old-fashioned, but if I'm paying out for a physical art book, the art should be presented the best in that art book, rather than on a tiny little preview screen. So that's annoying. So I would drop it all the way to a 3, but begrudgingly, because I understand why these choices have been made, I'm going to bump it up to a 3.5 for style. But it's still disappointing, and doesn't stand up to the other work that Stålenhag has done. So 3.5 for style. In terms of substance, extremely frustrating. Yeah, there's a little story. It's somewhat predictable. You can probably piece it together from what I have shown you, despite me cutting off the end, so it wouldn't be spoiled for you. And they're just, for someone like me coming at this interested in the world building and so on, it's just not there here. There's not enough detail. They could have put some side notes with some reports or something from the scientists on the things that they found on the surface, sketches, naturalist sketches of stuff that they'd found, or slides from a microscope, speculations from other scientists. You could have interspersed the storyline with that, and it wouldn't have detracted from the storyline, and it would have been much more interesting to someone like me, who's interested in the world building, is coming at this from the RPG perspective. That's it. It occurred to me that I only had the RPG books. I didn't have any of the art books, and I thought, let's pick up one of the art books. Mistake, I guess. So in terms of substance, there's just really not much there. I mean, you can piece together some from poring over the images that you can't see properly, but overall, yeah, it's just bleak, predictable, minimalist, and not in a good way for me. It doesn't have any of the appeal of those other books in terms of the world building and so on. So I begrudgingly give it a 2.5 for substance. So that's a total of 6 out of 10, 3 out of 5. Deeply average, which is not what you really want from an art book, particularly from someone who is so celebrated, particularly within our little community of game players and world builders. I look at this and then I look back to the Paper Tiger type books that I used to get in the past, Chris Akios's work, or the science fiction and fantasy world of Tim White, or Jim Byrne's Lightship, or even following the sort of narrative structure, if I go back to Great Space Battles or Thomas Cook Galactic Tours, things like that. The physical objects of those books always presented the art first, and presented the art well, and that was the primary concern. And when I buy an art book, I want to be able to see the art. Again, I really must emphasize that what you see on the screen is better than what I'm seeing here on the page, and that's not how anything should work. So yeah, disappointed. Guess I won't be buying any other art books. I'll stick to the RPGs. But RPG wise, there's nothing here either. I think Free League helped fund this book, but there isn't really a space for an RPG to exist in this world. It is too bleak, too impossible. There's not enough detail here to build a world onto, and what would it even be about? Sang. Old Fat Punks is part caper, part comedy, part nostalgia, and part commentary. It follows 3 aging punks as they build themselves up for one big, nihilistic last hurrah. You can buy Old Fat Punks at Amazon, Drive-Thru Fiction, or Lulu.com. Follow the links below or search on those sites.